Um, yeah, so a lot of my work since about 2014 has involved interacting with different audiences and decision makers around climate scenarios. That's never been like the sole focus of my work, but it's often been kind of quite pivotal, I suppose, to the work I've done, particularly with the financial sector and financial regulators and some other sorts of policymakers as well. Sorry, I'm just coming down with a cold, so I'm a bit sniffly. I think in that time, the understanding of scenarios has changed and evolved quite a bit, but we're still pretty early in the evolution, I think, of understanding and climate scenarios in a really nuanced way, so that they can, the potential of them, I suppose, can be fully realised out in the real world. Yeah, so I think these will be familiar to a lot of people. Just some examples of the things that I would hear, particularly when the financial sector was first engaging with climate. For many years, we would hear these sorts of sorts of problems. But just to sort of, sorry, I'm on the wrong side. Just to summarize, yeah, the challenges are often around whether scenarios are meant to be normative versus positive. I think it's often a bit more subtle and nuanced than that. But the context is really important. Lots of people are not paying anywhere near enough attention to the construct and the objectives behind the scenarios to be able to then sort of take the numbers, particularly numeric scenarios like the integrated assessment model pathways that are published through the IPCC cycles, to sort of take them and put them in context. For reference, though, it's there are very similar problems with other sorts of energy transition scenarios in particular. So I've done a lot of work focusing on the International Energy Agency scenarios, and they suffer a similar problem, even though they're kind of one organisation publishing a bunch of a much sort of smaller set of scenarios. These misunderstandings have still been pretty prevalent. And the other thing is that people really grab onto numbers in a really kind of deep way. If you just go to the next slide, please. I'm not sure if I'm there. Oh, that hasn't quite shown up, but hasn't quite manifested properly on the screen. That was an example of when there was kind of a bit of a moment of realization, I think around 2017-18, that a lot of BECCS was appearing in the climate scenarios, despite there not being very much of it actually out in the world, and still something that's pretty limited, but that some of the IAM scenarios were heavily relying on BECCS to meet warming goals. And just the next slide. It's a really excellent piece of reporting, by the way. It's from 2017 in Wired magazine. And so the sorts of things that we tend to hear is that, we'll need a lot of CCS specs. Another one was, Asian coal use will grow significantly through 2040. Oil demand will grow until 2030 or beyond. Those are just a few examples of the kinds of things that are often, asserted as fact, and on the basis of numbers that are in scenarios. So thanks, Narelle. If you could just go to the next slide. Sorry, this is an old version. You could just skip through. Yeah, sorry, just to that one. That one's great. Thank you. So this is, I think everyone will recognise the illustrated pathways from the 1.5 special report. I think this was a really good, clear example of a scenario, of using scenarios in ways that non-expert users could understand them and could actually get a bit of a sense of what the objective was, and that there were trade-offs, for example, between different energy sources and between the amount of fossil fuel mitigation, versus the amount of net CDR that would have to be affected to offset or counteract that to meet the 1.5 limit, or stay within the 1.5 warming limit. I think what, and I remember getting comments from people, people working in the financial sector, that they found this sort of thing very useful, particularly below the little list of numbers that appears below this, that gives some ideas of the shifts in different energy sources and mitigation sources over the coming decades. I think one area where this type of layout and concept didn't work so well was that it sort of gave the sense that these were all equivalent choices. It maybe didn't convey to all of those audiences that some of these negative emissions options, P3 and P4, are obviously like far more challenging than others, and create a whole bunch of difficulties. Thanks, Narelle. Okay. I think I'll just skip through these next two pretty quickly. They're just a couple of examples, again, from SR 1.5 that I thought were interesting. It's probably a little bit along the lines of what Anita just presented, where they're more sort of qualitative, sort of less numeric, and looking a bit more. I think what I liked about these examples, though, were that they were particularly looking at the trade-offs, and that's often that's often really important thing that you want to convey, is that there are the trade-offs, and to some extent also ideally the synergies between different mitigation pathways. If you could skip to the next one. So I'll just talk about a few issues that are becoming really prevalent, that perhaps further scenario development, the type of thing that Brian was talking about, and also the type of work that Anita is working on as well, could be helpful in addressing some of the emerging issues. I think everyone's probably really aware that there's been a lot of interest and attention on the role of transition minerals and in mitigating climate change, or in the energy transition in particular. This has been really quite interesting, I think, for a lot of us to see that something that perhaps didn't have a lot of attention in a lot of the scenarios has now become, seemingly this like really, really big issue. And there's a real appetite to discuss this, like a very big appetite to discuss this, and to also kind of, I think in a lot of cases, to frame it as like a real barrier to transition. There are some newer pieces of work looking at the role of transition minerals, but not heaps, as far as I'm aware. And it's something where the demand side of the equation is very important. There's a lot of variables on the demand side around technology processes, consumption patterns, infrastructure, and also to an extent things like recycling. If you just want to go to the next slide, please. This is a point about, this is more relates to the Earth system model. So I think it's not directly relevant to scenarios in a sense, although it's something to kind of be aware of, I suppose, is that a kind of a little industry of selling financial climate impact analytics has emerged in the last sort of 4 years or so. And this is a screenshot of a piece of work done by Moody's, for example, which acquired a company about 3 years ago called 427, who develop these services. So there's sometimes a bit of crossover, I think, between this work. It tends to be more bottom up, and like I said, more referring to Earth systems models. But yeah, it's not an area of interest. And the next slide, please. The use of carbon pricing, carbon price as a proxy, I think, for a lot of other policy measures. But that's, you know, I think that's always been understood by the modelling community and the scenario development community, that the carbon price is just depicting, you know, other ways of potentially other policy mitigation tools. But it's often come across as like the carbon price needs to be at this level, you know, and actual carbon price needs to be at this level. So it's becoming harder to get that, to, I guess, get like policy measures across when you're just referring to a carbon price. I think it's important to kind of be more nuanced. I know there's sort of pieces of work that unpack different policy prescriptions, or sorry, different policy tools. So it's that can be useful. And the next slide, please. Something else that's happened in the last sort of 1 to 2 years is inflation. Obviously, it's become like really prevalent. I'm not aware of this being considered very deeply in many of the climate scenarios that I've seen from of different types, but there's some emerging work around the systemically significant sectors and parts of the economy, because a lot of the inflation that we've seen has been supply side. It's very challenging for monetary policy, so you know, official interest rates and the like to address supply side inflation, and supply side factors are also really can be very much affected by climate change, by the impacts of climate change, and can lead to, you know, various sort of feedbacks in terms of the political feasibility of mitigation measures. It's something I think that could be really relevant and will probably be increasingly relevant over the coming years, is the use, the sort of the necessity of certain elements of economies. So what this research is showing, this is by Isabella Weber and a few colleagues, just came out in December. But what it's showing is that, interestingly, the oil and gas extraction, so upstream oil and gas sector, has a really big indirect effect on inflation. And one of the conclusions that the authors drew from this analysis is that it's going to be very hard to transition seamlessly from one energy system to another, that you know, have to kind of overbuild the new energy system first before switching off the old one. So it's something else that I think is not always depicted in a lot of sort of texture in scenarios and pathways. So I think.
So Kate, I just wanted to just chime in and say you have about a minute left.
Yeah, no, I think I'm just going to leave it there. There's Neural, if you just want to skip 2 slides ahead, that one's just sort of a list of the thing though. But yeah, just a couple of points just to make them safer, make scenarios safer, as the theme of this work program, is just to kind of encourage everyone involved in developing scenarios to be a lot more upfront in communicating your assumptions and the objectives, just far more than you'd think. It's a lot harder to get those things across than you might expect, and much more important. Thank you.